Welcome to Invest Well, Be Well, a podcast for wiser investing and stronger living. I'm Rusty Vanneman, longtime investment professional, and I'm joined each week by my co-host, Robin Murray.
Thanks, Rusty. I'm a storyteller and journalist, and I am so excited to explore the ideas, insights, and people shaping the intersection of performance and purpose.
This podcast is for thoughtful investors and driven professionals who want to grow in their portfolios and in their personal lives.
We'll talk long-term investing, behavioral finance, personal development, and what it takes to live and work with intention.
So let's get started. Let's invest well and be well together.
This podcast is brought to you by Main Management LLC. Since 2002, Main has been recognized as an ETF strategist that combines an institutional process with the personalized service of a boutique firm. We have a really exciting guest today to kick off our first episode. We're going to talk to Dr. Daniel Crosby. He's a psychologist and behavioral finance expert. He's the author of several New York Times bestsellers, including The Behavioral Investor and then his latest book, which is The Soul of Wealth. He's also the Chief Behavioral Officer at Orion Advisor Solutions.
It was great. We could not have asked for a better start to this podcast, and it is a heck of an interview. Dr. Crosby really is a rock star. Not only is he a behavioral finance expert, but he's a legit investment mind when it comes to investing. And in this interview, he discusses his best-selling book, The Soul of Wealth, which I cannot recommend enough. First, Robin, what were your key takeaways?
Well, I always love talking to people who are going to get into the finance industry from the behavioral aspect, because to me, as a non-finance person in my background, that's just the most interesting part. And I mean, really it is. It's the people part of this industry, which is, it's just fascinating. The psychology behind money and the markets is just so interesting, and he's such an expert at that. It was just great to have him on. He's also a writer. I mean, he's written 4 books. So as a writer, it's just really cool to hear him talk about that process and how he got those done. And he did such a great job with them. He also has some tips for weight loss, which, hey, that's exciting. Always exciting. And I implemented those like the next day. So yeah, I mean, a lot of really great stuff.
Yeah, I mean, it was loaded, and you're right. On those particular topics, kind of the mission, motivations, and process of writing The Soul of Wealth, that was really fascinating. But again, it's just loaded. It's just behavioral finance, talking about psychological wealth, all kinds of BFI topics, including like overconfidence and its impact on investing. He had a really interesting section on how to improve investor behavior through what he called the 3 E's, a very key topic. And of course, he talked about the financial advisor's role in investor success. So not only was it practical advice, it was covered the gamut. It was fun, and we had some fun with it. So
yeah, good stuff. Well, hey, let's get to it.
Enjoy the interview. We did. Let's get to it.
Dr. Daniel Crosby, welcome to Invest Well, Be Well. It's such a pleasure to have you on the show, our first guest on our new show.
Hey, congratulations on the new show. It's great to be with you. I'm honored to be number one.
Well, it makes so much sense for you to be the first guest on this podcast, Invest Well and Be Well. And of course, we're bringing a tradition over from the last podcast Robin and I hosted together, and that is a walk-up song. We need to set the scene for the interview. And of course, we'll be starting a new playlist on Spotify. What is your walk-up song?
I am going with a recency bias pick in honor of the late, great Brian Wilson, who passed away yesterday. I'm going to choose Good Vibrations. And the reason I choose Good Vibrations is because Brian Wilson, the genius, taught us that the theremin could be used not only for spooky ghost songs, but for summertime love jams as well. So truly incredible to include a really strange instrument that is associated almost exclusively with spookiness in a sweet summertime bop. So rest in peace, Brian Wilson. Good Vibrations is the walk-up song.
What a beautiful song to start a playlist with. I did send out the song Surf's Up to a whole bunch of people, which is my favorite Beach Boys song. Good Vibrations, awesome.
Yes, that's perfect. All right, so Daniel, let's talk about you and your background a little bit. You're very well known in our industry as a behavioral finance expert and a thought leader. But tell us a little bit about your background and what got you interested in this area of study.
So I started off as a clinical psychologist. I went to college thinking I would be a financial advisor like my dad. I started my freshman year thinking that I would be a financial advisor like my dad. I saw that he had a good life He made good money. He was home at 4 o'clock every day. And I was like, this is a good life. But after my first year of college, I served a 2-year mission for my church where I was in the Philippines. And in the Philippines, a kid from Alabama sees traditions and cultures and customs and ways of living that he was not previously privy to. And I just fell in love with people and helping people. And so at this point, I came back, starting my sophomore year of college 2 years later, and said, look, I've got to do something to continue what I've been doing the last couple of years, which is helping people, studying culture and people and why people do the things that they do. So I sort of left the finance piece in the background and began a pursuit of a degree in psychology. Well, 3 days after I finished my bachelor's, I started my PhD. And so, I was fairly young. And about 3 years into my PhD program, I'm 23 years old trying to tell people how to live their lives, which is, absolutely hysterical. And, in hindsight, but I really began to burn out. I was young. I had poor boundaries. I had sort of a limited experience of the world, and I was taking my work home with me in a pretty big way. And I said, look, I came to my father and I said, look, I love studying people. It's got to be part of my work to study why people do the things that they do. But I'm not sure that I want to do it in a medical or a clinical context because this is awfully heavy. And what my dad said to me, and this is, 20 years ago, was he said, well, there's a lot of psychology in my work. Now, my dad is a wirehouse advisor in Alabama. He did not know what behavioral economics was 20 years ago. But, just this sort of passing comment on the part of my dad set me on a path that led me to discover, Dan Gilbert and Danny Kahneman and Richard Thaler and all these people, these bright lights in behavioral economics and behavioral finance. So long story short, I fell in love with the discipline and sort of made it my personal mission to be a translator or an intermediary between the academics and then the people like my dad who are in the trenches doing the work with clients every day. I saw people like my dad who knew sort of roughly that there was a lot of psychology in his work, but didn't have access or acumen to be able to understand what it all meant. And so I've tried to be that intermediary or that translator between those two worlds.
Well, we have to talk about your latest book because it's been a smash hit. I think it's a must read for all investors, personal and professional. It's called The Soul of Wealth. And of course, it's a collection of essays on money and meaning, which is a perfect theme for this podcast. What does the phrase soul of wealth mean to you personally?
So, when we think about the word soul, it means a couple of things. And one of them is sort of the essence of something. And that's what I tried to do with this book, was to write about money and wealth in its most essential form. So what do I mean by that? When this country was founded, Rusty, like nearly 250 years ago, 85% of the world was living in poverty, which is $2, what would today be $2 or less a day. So effectively, everybody everywhere was backbreakingly poor, 85% of the world. Today, that number is about 8.5%. So we have had an incredible, in a relatively short period of time, an incredible growth in wealth and explosion of the middle class, not only in this country, but around the world. And yet over that time, we're less connected. We are lonelier. We're sadder. We're, more suicidal. Like all of these measures of sort of our wellness have fallen off a cliff, even as our financial wellness has had hockey stick type growth. So I became really obsessed with this question of how can it be that there's this explosion of material wealth, but this psychological impoverishment, this impoverishment of the spirit? And are there things that we can understand about money that can help us spend, save, and invest it in ways that lead to more human flourishing. Because what good is it if it's not making us happier and it's not making us better?
That's fascinating. So in your work, you blend, as you said, you blend psychology, finance, and philosophy. How do those all come together in this book?
Well, Robin, the reason that I did that, besides just loving those disciplines, was this is my fourth book. This is my third solo book. And anyone who's written a book can tell you it sits at the intersection of two very interesting worlds. One is things that are very hard to do, and one is things that pay very poorly. So there's not many things that you can do that are this hard that lead to a smaller, financial benefit. And so I said, look, if I'm going to do this crazy thing again, I need to produce something that's evergreen. And for me, the way to do that was to look for agreement between the behavioral science literature, the philosophical, and then sometimes even the faith traditions that I drew on in these things. When we're talking about things like generosity and charity and things like that, of course, there's faith traditions who have spoken in favor of that for millennia. And so I thought, look, if the philosophers and the great thinkers and the philosophers and the scientists sort of all agree, maybe we're on to something. So that was my goal here, was to look for sort of multiple points of truth. And, the way that I structured each of the 50 chapters, each of them begins with a historical anecdote. So some sort of narrative example that sort of illustrates the point just for memorability's sake. Then we talk about the research. Then we talk about application. So it's sort of story, then science, then so what? So it is both, sort of engaging, hopefully, and also applicable to advisors and clients' daily lives.
All right, well, let's talk about your three books, kind of your three children here. So how would you describe your three different books? How are they different from each other?
So the first book, The Laws of Wealth, this is sort of my 10 commandments of investor behavior. This is, look, if you were just going to do a handful or two handfuls of things right, and you were going to get these things right, this is the 10 to get right. Because I'm a believer in rules, and I'm a believer in simple rules. I believe that that's kind of the way that great things get accomplished, is by just doing a couple of simple but important things right with a great deal of consistency. So that's what The Laws of Wealth is. The second book, The Behavioral Investor, is probably the most industry specific and the most cerebral. That is a book about asset management. I mean, The Behavioral Investor is based on my belief that there is alpha to be had in running money in a way that understands human behavior. And I sort of make the case in there, that a lot of the underperformance and a lot of the reason that active management gets a bad name is not because there's no value to be had in active management, but because it's done with a lack of behavioral sophistication and a lack of discipline. And so the behavioral investor, sort of my belief that we could make the world of running money better if we understood people more deeply. And then the Soul of Wealth is at this intersection of money and meaning. It's going to talk about things like, okay, so you've read the first two books, you've applied the principles, you made some money. Like, now how can you save, spend, and invest it in ways that will make you happy? It's the one that is candidly the least, the least about money, and it's only sort of tangentially about money, insofar as it is about money and how money might make you happy or sad.
One quick follow-up on The Soul of Wealth. Something I really like about it is I tell people that you can read it on an airplane, but you don't want to. You kind of want to take your time with each chapter. And my wife and I will read a chapter and talk about it, which gives me the idea, which I'm sure you already have, is a follow-up companion book at some point, like a journal. I mean, it's almost like you needed 52 chapters for a chapter a week for a year.
So, Rusty, there was method to my madness. It's 50 chapters because you're going on vacation. You got to take 2 weeks vacation. You got to take 2 weeks off, go to the beach, and put The Soul of Wealth down and read some glossy novel with the author's, name in 88-point font and glossy letters on the front. But, Rusty, it's funny. I stole the format of the book, like absolutely just ripped it off of Rick Rubin. So I had started to write the book, and I was about 80 pages in. And I knew I wanted to write a book about money and meaning. And I was writing The Soul of Wealth the way I had written my other books, which is, 12 chapters, 20 pages a piece. And I had written about 4 chapters. I was 80 pages in, and it just sucked. It just wasn't good. I just don't know how to say it. It was just sort of uninspired. I didn't love it. So I scrapped it, which was hard when you've done that much work, but I scrapped it. I knew it needed to be better. And in the meantime, I started reading Rick Rubin's book, The Creative Act, which I would really recommend to everyone. And Rick Rubin's book, I think, is 70-something chapters, and they're, 2 or 3 pages long, sometimes 4. And they're just little quick hitter, almost like creativity devotionals. And for me, someone with a busy life and someone trying to be a good husband and father and a good employee, I want to read every evening, but I'm also very tired by the time I make it to my room to read. And so The Creative Act was just such a revelation to me because I was able to, knock out 2 or 3 chapters and I felt like I was accomplishing something. And whereas, a 20-page chapter, I get, halfway through and start falling asleep and dropping the book on my face. And so I wrote it that way. And then I wrote, honestly, I wish I mean, a little inside baseball here. I wrote in the introduction, like, hey, you should read this the way that Rusty just said. Read it once at a time, discuss it with someone you love, treat it sort of like a weekly devotional type situation. And honestly, that was sort of a throwaway comment, just because I thought it was cool that there were, about 50 weeks in a year and about 50 chapters in the book. And people have really run with it. People have really run. Almost everyone I talk to says that's the way they're reading it. And it's great. It's great.
Yeah. So you have contributed so much to our knowledge on behavioral finance and investor psychology. What do you think is the most common behavioral mistakes that investors still make today, and why are they so persistent?
So in the behavioral investor, the best part of the behavioral investor is I take the universe of behavioral biases and I break them down into 4 meta biases. And these are sort of biases that account for many smaller biases and many smaller behaviors. And of those 4, you're asking me to crown the Mac Daddy king of all biases, and I'm going to do it. And it's ego, which is, the various flavors of overconfidence. And the reason we've got to give ego the crown, the reason we give overconfidence the crown is if you're deeply overconfident, it's the bias that begets all other biases. It's the bias that enables every other bias because you're blind to your own bias because you're so high on yourself. And so overconfidence, it has to be said, is the mother of all biases. As to why people do these things, they do these things because they work. One of the things that makes investing so hard is that the biases that serve us poorly in investing, including overconfidence, serve us very well in other domains of our life. When you look at the wealthiest people you'll ever meet have almost all started businesses. Starting a business, mathematically speaking, is stupid. Just from a probability perspective, strictly probabilistically, starting a business, starting a restaurant, being an entrepreneur is a losing bet, massively losing. Not even close. Whatever stat you want to look at, 90, 85, whatever % of businesses fail in a relatively short order. So you are saying I'm different. I'm top decile here at this thing, and these other people didn't know what they're doing. That's overconfidence. Anytime you take an entrepreneurial journey, if you write a book, when I went and when I went and talked to my now wife, right? Like that was overconfidence. It served me well, right? All of these things that we do, they serve us well in other parts of our life. It's just when we take the things that are serving us well in other parts of our life and apply them to investing that we get sideways. I talk about, this is a comic book reference, but I talk about, there's this idea of Bizarro Superman, right? Well, I talk about Wall Street Bizarro world in my books, and the rules of everyday life and the rules of investing are almost diametrically opposed from one another. It's like 180 degrees from each other. And so they persist because they usually work. Being emotionally led, being sort of quick on your feet, being overconfident, this is good stuff, like in many parts of life. And in fact, even following our intuition, when you look at something like, should you trust someone you're on a date with? Your intuition is actually an excellent guide to whether or not you should trust the person you're on a date with, but it's a horrible guide to whether or not you should pick a stock. And so it's just a misapplication of something that works really well in other parts of life.
So behavioral finance has just exploded in recent years in terms of popularity. Books are bestsellers. In your opinion, do you think investor behavior has actually improved with all this new information and tools?
So it actually has. There's actually evidence to show that it has. And I don't know all of the reasons why, but let's take a little journey. I think one of the things is that investors have learned from markets. We know about recency bias, right? I talked about it when I chose my walk-up song. But if you look at the last, 20 or so years, the decision to buy every dip has been the right decision. And markets have rebounded rather quickly. And people, I think part of it is not so much the bestsellers or the education, it's that the market is teaching people. If we had a lost decade again, if we had a lost decade, I think people would unlearn some of those things. But I think some of the historical realities, the 2000 to 2010 drought in the S&P, Japan, things like that, feel a little bit like a distant memory now. And so I think the market has taught people to be patient and that it always comes back, which is, true until it's not. And then the other thing is, I do think investors are better armed and better educated than ever before, and they're learning some good lessons. So I think it's a combination of the market environment and perhaps the bestsellers and the education that's around.
This episode of Invest Well, Be Well is brought to you by Main Management LLC, a pioneer in actively managed ETFs since 2002. Main Management starts with a clear fiduciary focus, delivering the transparency and personal attention you'd expect from a boutique firm. They provide financial advisors with solutions, not products. Main also believes investors should keep more of what they earn, emphasizing net of fee after-tax performance to help clients retain more of their returns. I've known Main Management for years. I've met thousands of managers over the course of my career, and one quality I really value: they invest alongside their clients. They eat their own cooking. Over 10% of the assets they manage are their own partner assets, and more than half of the firm are partners themselves. That says a lot. To learn more about Main strategies, including buy right hedged equity, U.S. sector rotation, thematic innovation, and all asset models, please visit their website at mainmgt.com.
So how can financial advisors take this information and help their clients navigate their biases and all these behavioral pitfalls and really align their investments with their values?
So there's a 3-part, I call it my 3 E's. And I think if I did come up with this, I think this is a good way for advisors to think about this. The first E is the one that Rusty and I just spoke about. The first E is for education. One of the first roles of an advisor is to educate her clientele around how markets work. Because just for a very simple example, the average intra-year drawdown in the S&P is something like 13 or 14% a year. So just about every year since World War II, on average, we've had about 10% drawdown per year over long periods of time. Most people don't understand that. And most people think that every 10% drawdown, the sky is falling, the world is caving in, and the media would lead you to believe that. Like, I mean, it happened earlier this year. So educating clients on how markets work, the sources, the drivers of return, how markets work, how you get paid for enduring volatility, things like that. Educating them about some of the fundamentals of how markets work is sort of job one. The second piece, that's probably the most ignored piece, is the environment. One of my biggest learnings as a student of human behavior is that most people are as well behaved or as poorly behaved as the environment they find themselves in. And we don't love this because it sort of flies in the face of free will. It flies in the face of our romantic notions about grit and self-determination and things like that. But most people are about as smart or as dumb as their surroundings. And so, if you're on a diet, you shouldn't buy Oreos and keep them in your pantry, like stuff like that. And with investors, the portfolio they are in has a material impact on their ability to take the ride. And too many advisors do what I call spreadsheet optimization. So they're deeply technical, they're analytical or mathematical, and they calculate sort of this tricked out, perfect portfolio in a vacuum. But investors don't live in a vacuum. They live in the real world that's full of fear and doubt and uncertainty and short-termism. And so the idea here is to maximize anxiety-adjusted returns for investors, to give those investors the best returns that they can stomach. And the best portfolio is not the one that's the best on a spreadsheet. It's the best that they can handle. And so understanding that difference is material. So that's environment. And then the last one is encouragement. Encouragement is, look, even the best educated client with the perfect anxiety-adjusted portfolio is still going to have the dark night of the soul where they want to do the wrong thing and they panic, and they're going to need the trusted voice of a trusted friend and advisor to encourage them to stay on the path. So those are the three things that advisors can do. They can teach their clients, they can educate their clients on how markets work, they can attend to the environment, give them a portfolio that maximizes the likelihood of their ability to stay the course, and they can be a friend. They can encourage them during that dark night of the soul to stay the course.
So Daniel, you've created so many different behavioral finance tools, including risk tolerance surveys and such. What role does self-awareness play in becoming a better investor?
A limited role. So this is in the category of answers that no one likes. But, Danny Kahneman talked about this, and I'm with him, that, let me give a less cynical answer. Self-awareness only matters when you put yourself at arm's length from the thing that you're bad at, right? So knowing that I'm emotional or overconfident in a vacuum does very little if I'm trying to white knuckle my way past those tendencies that I have. And I do have both of those. So that's a great example. So if you talk about someone who's emotional and overconfident, simply knowing that about myself does very little to make me different. The thing that makes a difference is what we call meta knowledge, like knowing what you don't know. So let's say I know that I'm emotional and overconfident. So rather than trying to gut my way past those deeply ingrained personality traits of mine, I pay an advisor, right? Like I pay an advisor to manage my money. And, my advisor, who's my dad, but, my advisor hasn't written 4 books on behavioral finance. I have. So I could say like, what am I paying this guy for? Like, when I could do this myself. But you have to know that you're overconfident and then take steps to really distance yourself from that. So it is kind of a sad commentary on human nature. But I think unless you kind of, lock the lock, take the key and throw it in the ocean, there's not much that changes unless you put yourself at arm's length from the temptation.
So money in general is emotional, right? As you've said. So how do we better integrate emotion and reason when we're making financial decisions?
So, one of my favorite studies from the behavioral investor, it's a little spicy. So they hooked people up to fMRI machines, so brain scan machines, and they showed them different types of different stimuli. So things around money, but also sex and death and politics and religion and, just all the stuff that you don't talk about at a nice party. And they watched the excitatory power in the brain. And what these researchers found was that money had more ability to excite than any of these other hot button issues, which is an incredible commentary on the emotional pull of money relative to, again, all those other things which were similarly, also emotional about. So money is not just emotional. It's arguably the most emotional thing. And so we can never divorce our financial decisions from emotion entirely. In fact, far from it. But what we can do is anytime we can make a human tendency work for us instead of against us, that's a good thing. What do I mean by that? We know that humankind is lazy and status quo prone. That is well documented. Like our status quo proneness, our laziness is well documented about us as a human race. If you look at the most powerful behavioral economic intervention of all time, it was something called Save More Tomorrow, which was the process of auto-withdrawing and auto-escalating retirement savings over time. So instead of trying to count on people to do the right thing every 2 weeks and, take a chunk out of their paycheck and save it for a rainy day, it just said, look, we know people are lazy. So if we can get them to do this once, and we can get them to bump it every time they get a raise, they're going to be lazy in a way that helps them. They're going to be status quo prone in a way that helps them. And we can do the same thing with emotion and money. I cite research in The Soul of Wealth that talks about how people who look at a picture of their children before they make a financial decision make much better decisions and save more money because they've sort of re-centered themselves on the things that matter and why they're making these sacrifices in the first place. And so there are ways that we can use emotion to make better financial decisions. People who vividly imagine their retirement save way more. I believe it's 72% more than people who don't. That's an emotional decision, but it's a good emotional decision. So the difference between, Rusty saying, hey, I want to retire to Park City, is sort of generically, and me as Rusty's advisor sitting down with him and saying, which mountain do you want to be near, and where are you going to ski, and where are you going to drink your coffee in the morning, and where will the grandkids play, and really helping him get some emotion around that can get him excited about it. So rather than trying to grit our teeth and just be emotionless, I think it pays to put emotion on our side in ways that matter and try and make it work for us because it's always there.
Great tips in there. I recently revisited the classic book, Benjamin Graham's The Intelligent Investor, 5th edition, Jason Zweig commentary. It's killer. And it is interesting. A lot of people think that book is just about numbers, but there's a lot of behavior in it. And Benjamin Graham and Jason Zweig talk about some people kind of just need a mad money account because they're just too interested in the market. So have a small amount of your portfolio sort of cut out to kind of scratch that itch. So anyway, Well, we talked about definitions of success at the top of the show, and I think this next question could be one of our standard closing questions here on Invest Well, Be Well. But how do you personally define a successful life?
So over the last, I've been drifting further and further from money, Rusty. So, I had these first two books, which were explicitly about, picking stocks and making good financial decisions. The Soul of Wealth is sort of 50-50 money and meaning. My next book is going to be 100% meaning, right? I've been thinking a lot because I'm getting a lot of grays. I ran into my aunt recently and I said, "Hey, Aunt so-and-so." And she was like, "Who are you?" And I said, it's Daniel. And she said, "Oh, you're so gray." So it's like, as I get older and older, I start to think more and more about this question. I think it's a good one. So for the last year or so, I've been studying what makes life meaningful. And the research shows that there's really like three things. One is, I call it believing, belonging, and becoming. So this is what the research says. The first is people who lead lives that they perceive as meaningful have a rule book. They believe in something. They have a moral code, whether it's a philosophical or a religious tradition they adhere to. They have rules for living and they hold themselves to some sort of standard, which I think is a sensible way to do things, to have a roadmap for life. So to live in accordance with your values, to believe in something and to live in accordance with that, I think is the first leg of the stool. Belonging is the second one, and the one that's the most predictive of happiness and flourishing. Belonging is just giving love and receiving love, right? Like loving people and letting them love you, mattering to people and having them matter to you. And then becoming is about your growth. Like it's having a vision of the type of person you could become with some effort and some hard work and the ways that you could grow and improve over time. So that to me is my simple sort of 3-part checklist for how am I doing? Am I living according to my beliefs? Am I loving well and allowing myself to be loved? And am I growing? Am I pushing myself to be more than I am today? And man, I think if you get those 3 things right, you're doing something big.
Okay, so what routines or practices help you maintain focus, clarity, or purpose in your work? We're talking about the Be Well part of our Invest Well, Be Well here.
Yeah, so Rusty will have had a front row seat to this, but over the last a year plus, about 15 months now, I've lost 65 pounds. And so I had, through a combination of eating all my kids' chicken nuggets and traveling a lot, I'd put on a lot of weight. And, I have gotten in the best shape of my life over the past year. In keeping with what I talked about from the laws of wealth earlier, the way that I did it is enormously simple, not easy. I mean, it's hard. It takes discipline, but it's very simple. I did 2 things. I stayed over a protein goal with my eating. I had a pretty aggressive protein goal to try and build muscle and stay strong. And then I had a calorie goal. So stay under a calorie goal and over a protein goal. It is worth mentioning I was already good about exercising. I was already walking a good amount. I was already getting, 10,000 plus steps a day, pretty much every day. I was already working out 7 days a week. But I was still overweight because I had not locked in my eating. And those 2 things, that is the only thing that I've done. And when people see how dramatically, my health and my appearance has changed, people assume it's a lot bigger. Like people assume that it's been more than that I have some sort of crazy workout regimen or that I've taken drugs or something like that, or that I got sick or something. And the thing it has been is really those 2 things. So it's been an awesome testament to me about the power of doing just a couple of things right, but doing them right every day. So whether it's your money, your health, like what are the 2 or 3 things that are going to move the needle for you, and just do those things to death. That's what's been big for me.
Quick follow up on that. What were the rules on protein and calories?
So the calories when I was starting out, I'm get a little technical here. I calculated my total daily energy expenditure. So just, my height, my weight, my age, my level of activity. And you can go to a total daily energy expenditure calculator and get a good, a decent idea of what that is. I believe when I started out, my TDEE was about 2,800 calories a day. I mean, it's much lower now because I've lost weight. But, when I started out, I was, burning about 2,800 calories a day. And so I said, okay, I'm going to eat 2,500 calories a day or 2,300 calories a day. So I set it, I wanted to be eating less than I was burning, obviously, because that's how you lose weight. But I didn't want it to be so dramatic that it was crippling. People would say, were you eating 1,200 calories a day? No, I never got lower than 2,100. I was eating 2,100 calories at my very lowest. Today, it's between 24 and 2,500 for maintenance. And so, yeah, just a slight, a slight calorie deficit, and then 1 gram of protein per pound of ideal body weight. So when I started out, I weighed 230 when I started out, and I was shooting for 175 to 180 grams of protein a day. Today I weigh 165, and so I shoot for 165 grams of protein a day. But so basically, call it a gram of protein per pound of ideal body weight, and, a slight calorie deficit when you're trying to lose weight, and then just maintenance when you're trying to stay put.
How did you count all this? Is there a certain app that you recommend?
I used MyFitnessPal, and it must be said, it's not, it's not fun, right? It's not fun. And I always had to plan the day in advance, and it's not fun for your partner either, because, every day I'd be like, okay, to my wife, okay, what are we doing for dinner? I could tell you exactly what we're having for dinner tonight, because I sort of plan everything out. But once you lock in, though, it's annoying at first, but now I'm definitely to the point where it's good. The other thing that I'll say that I think is important and has allowed me to stick with it, I eat a candy bar every night at 8:00. This is kind of become my ritual. It's usually a Snickers bar. I loaded up on Crunchy bars when I was in England earlier this year, so now I've got some delicious Cadbury chocolate that I had been having. But it was important for me to not feel like I was being deprived. When I had tried to lose weight before, it was always too onerous. You cut out carbs, or you cut out bread, or something like that. And the thing that I loved about this approach was that it was moderate. And, I have a Snickers bar, a Reese's cup every night. And that's the first thing I get up in the morning and I put in Snickers bar, because whatever else I eat that day, I want to make sure I eat that Snickers bar and I don't feel that denial. And again, it goes to money, infrequent.
That money account that we're
talking
about.
Yeah. Infrequent splurges feel more meaningful. Man, I tell you, Rusty, that Snickers bar hits like a Mack truck at 8:00 when you've been eating healthy all day. That thing tastes better than you would believe.
Well, so we're down to the last couple questions here. So if someone only has time to improve one thing about their financial life this year, what would you recommend it to be?
So one of the last chapters, I don't think it's the last chapter, but it's toward the back, 10% of the book, talks about improving yourself. And, when people meet people like us and they find out that we work in finance, I think we are often asked about externalities. They'll ask us, what's the Fed going to do? What's this stock going to do? What's the president going to do? And all of that stuff is unknowable and uncontrollable. But the biggest driver of your wealth is your earning power. And the biggest driver of your earning power is your education. So, getting that extra letter, getting those extra letters behind your name, taking a certificate course, starting a side hustle, going back to school. All of these things are much surer predictors of growing wealth than, trying to time the market or predict what Donald Trump's going to do or Jerome Powell. The other thing that I found in the book, people who exercise make more than their same education, non-exercise peers. People who have a mentor make more than people without a mentor. People who go to therapy make dramatically more than people who don't go to therapy. And if you think about the modern workplace, we really work in a relational economy, and your ascension through an organization or your lack of ascension through an organization is going to have more to do with how well you get along with the people than with your competency. And that is a thing that people don't want to hear, but it is absolutely true. And so something like going to therapy and working on your interpersonal skills has a positive impact on your earning potential too. So take care of yourself, take care of your body, take care of your mental health, and sharpen that saw through education and further training.
A great note to end on. Dr. Crosby, thank you so much for coming on the show. It's been such a great conversation. But before we let you go, we do want to ask you to tell our listeners how they can stay in touch and learn more about what you're doing.
My pleasure. You all are doing wonderful work here, so thank you. I'm excited for the new show. If you want to learn more about what I'm up to, I'm Daniel Crosby, PhD on LinkedIn. I have a podcast called Standard Deviations. You can read the book, The Soul of Wealth, or you can check out our free CE offerings through the Orion Advisor Academy and just go sign up and get some free learning that we just talked about.
Well, I should also put in a plug for Standard Deviations, one of my favorite podcasts. Your format this year is really compelling, going through the soul of wealth. So people should definitely check that out. Daniel, thank you so very much. Your schedule is crazy busy. I know you're always producing so much content. You're on the road speaking all the time. It's summer holidays. So thank you so very much for your time. We really appreciate it.
My pleasure. Congrats, all.
This podcast is hosted by Rusty Vanneman and Robin Murray and produced by Garrett Crosby. Well, we'll be back next week. Thanks for listening to Invest Well, Be Well. And hey, if you like this episode, don't forget to subscribe.
If you have feedback, guest suggestions, or just want to connect, please visit my website, rustysbridge.com, or email me directly at rusty@rustysbridge.com. Until next time, invest well and be well.